Chapter 5 of The Giant's Robe by F. Anstey. Recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Neighbours. More than a week had passed since the scene in Malakoff Terrace described in my last chapter, a week spent by Mark in the drudgery of schoolwork, which had grown more distasteful than ever now he could indulge in no golden dreams of a glorious deliverance, for he could not accept his new prospects as an adequate substitute, and was beginning to regret his abandonment of his true ambitions with a longing that was almost fierce. He had gone down to the Woodbines, his uncle's villa at Chigbourne, in pursuance of the invitation given him, and Mr. Lightowler's undisguised recovery of the feeling of proprietorship in him, and his repeated incitements to pursue his studies with unwearying ardour, only increased Mark's disgust with himself and his future, as he walked along the lanes with his relative towards the little church beyond the village on the last Sunday in November. It was a bright, clear, frosty day, with a scarlet sun glowing through dun-coloured clouds, and a pale blue sky beyond the haze above their heads. The country landscape had suggestions of Christmas cheeriness, impossible enough to Londoners who cannot hope to share in country house revels à la Mr. Caldecott, but vaguely exhilarating notwithstanding. Mark knew that his Christmas would be passed in town with his family, who would keep it, as they observed Sunday, and refrain from any attempt at seasonable jollity. Yet he began to feel elated by its approach, or the weather, or some instinct of youth and health, which set his blood tingling and drove away his dissatisfaction with every step he took. Uncle Solomon had come out in broadcloth and a large hat with such an ecclesiastical brim that it influenced his conversation, causing it to be more appropriate than Sunday talk will sometimes be, even amongst the best people. He discoursed of ritualism, and deplored the hold it had acquired on the vicar, and the secret manoeuvres of the detested Humpage in the vestry. 'I was brought up a Baptist,' he said, 'and I'll go back to 'em now if I didn't know they'd all crow about it. And they're a poor lot at Little Bethel, too, not a penny piece among 'em. When we get into the church,' he continued, 'you give a look left of the chancel, close by the door where the shelf is with the poor loaves. You'll see a painted winder there which that 'Umpage got put up to his aunt. That's his ostentation, that is. I don't believe he ever had an aunt, but I don't wish to judge him, only you look at that window and tell me how it strikes you afterwards. He's got the artist to do him as the Good Samaritan there. I call it scandalous. There's no mistake about it. The air's not the same colour, and the Eastern robes hide it a bit, but he's there for all that. I don't relish seeing 'Umpage figuring away in painted glass and a great gaudy turban every time I look up. He's quite aggravating enough in his pew. If I chose to go to the expense, I could put up a winder too, and have myself done.' 'As a saint?' suggested Mark. 'Never you mind. And if I liked to be a saint on glass, I could, I suppose. I'm a churchwarden, and there's no reason why 'Umpage should have all the painted windows to himself, but I shouldn't care to make myself so conspicuous. 'Umpage now, he likes that sort of thing.' This brought them to the church, a perpendicular building with a decidedly Early English smell in it, and Uncle Solomon led the way to his pew, stopping to nudge Mark as they passed the memorial to his enemy's meretricious aunt. He nudged him again presently, after he had retired behind the ecclesiastical hat, and emerged again to deal out some very large prayer and hymn books as if they were cards. 'That's him, that's 'Umpage,' he said in a loud whisper. Mark looked up in time to see an old gentleman advance to the door of the pew in front of them, a formidable looking old gentleman with a sallow face, long iron grey locks, full grey eyes, a hook nose, and prominent teeth under a yellowish grey moustache and beard. He felt a sudden shame, for behind Mr. Humpage came a pretty child with long floating light hair, with a staid fresh-faced woman in grey, and last a girl of about 19 or 20, who seemed to have caught the very audible whisper, for she glanced in its direction as she passed in with the slightest possible gleam of amused surprise in her eyes, and a lifting of her delicate eyebrows. A loud intoned 'Amen' came from the vestry just then, the organ played a voluntary, and the vicar and curate marched in at the end of a procession of little surpliced country boys, whose boots made a very undevotional clatter over the brasses and flagstones. As a Low Churchman, Mr. Lightowler protested against this processional pomp by a loud snort, which expression of opinion he repeated at any tendency to genuflection on the part of the clergyman during the service, until the little girl turned round and gazed at him with large concerned eyes, as if she thought he must be either very devout or extremely unwell. Mark heard little of the service. He was dimly aware of his uncle singing all the psalms and responses with a lusty tunelessness, and coming to fearful grief in gallant attempts to follow the shrill little choristers over a difficult country of turns and flourishes. He explained afterwards that he liked to set an example of 'joining in.' But Mark saw little else but the soft shining knot of hair against the dark sables of the hat and tippet of his beautiful neighbour, and a glimpse of her delicate profile now and then, as she turned to find the places for her little sister, who invariably disdained assistance as long as possible. He began to speculate idly on her probable character. Was she proud? There was a shade of disdain about her smile when he first saw her. Self-willed? The turn of her graceful head was slightly imperious. She could be tender with it all. He inferred that from the confidence with which the child nestled against her as the sermon began, and the gentle protecting hand that drew her closer still. Mark had been in and out of love several times in his life. His last affair had been with a pretty shallow flirt with a clever manner picked up at second hand, and though she had come to the end of her repertoire and ceased to amuse or interest him long before they parted by mutual consent, he chose to believe his heart for ever blighted and proof against all other women, so that he was naturally in the most favourable condition for falling an easy victim. He thought he had never seen any one quite like this girl, so perfectly natural and unaffected, and yet with such an indefinable air of distinction in her least movement. What poems, what books might not be written with such an influence to inspire them? And then Mark recollected with a pang that he had done away with all that for ever now. That most delicate form of homage would be beyond his power, even if he ever had the opportunity of paying it, and the thought did not tend to reconcile him to his lot. Would chance ever bring him within the sphere of his new found divinity? Most probably not. Life has so many of these tantalising half glimpses which are never anything more. If she is Humpage's daughter, he thought, I'm afraid it's hopeless, but she shall not pass out of my life if I can help it. And so he dreamed through the sermon, with the vicar's high cracked voice forming a gentle clacking accompaniment, which he quite missed when the benediction came upon him unexpectedly. They came out of church into bright November sunshine. The sun had disengaged itself now from the dun clouds, melted the haze, and tempered the air almost to the warmth of early spring. Mark looked round for Mr. Humpage and his party, but without success. They had lingered behind, perhaps, as he could not help fearing, designedly. He determined, however, to find out what he could about them, and approached the subject diplomatically. 'I saw the window,' he began. 'That was the Good Samaritan in front, of course. I recognised him by the likeness at once.' 'He took care it should be like,' said Uncle Solomon, with a contemptuous sniff. 'That was his family with him, I suppose?' Mark asked carelessly. 'Umpage is a bachelor, or gives himself out for such,' said his uncle, charitably. 'Then those young ladies, are they residents here?' 'Which young ladies?' 'In his pew,' said Mark, a little impatiently. 'The little girl with the long hair, and the other one.' 'You don't go to church to stare about, do you? I didn't take any notice of them. They're strangers here friends of Umpage, I dare say. That was his sister in grey, she keeps house for him, and they say he leads her a pretty life with his tempers. Did you see that old woman behind in a black coal scuttle? That was old widow Barnjum. Keeps a sweet stuff shop down in the village. I've seen her that far in liquor sometimes she can't find her way about, and has to be taken home in a barrow. You wouldn't think it to look at her, would you? I shall give the vicar the 'int to tell old John Barker he ought to stay away till he's got over that cough of his.
It's enough to make anybody ill to listen to him. I've a good mind to tell him of it myself, and I will too if I come across him. The Colonel wasn't in church again. They tell me he's turned atheist, and loafs about all Sunday with a gun. I've seen him myself driving a dog-cart Sunday afternoons in a pot-hat, and I knew then what would come of that. Here we are again,' he said, as they reached the palings of the Woodbines. 'We'll just stroll round to get an appetite for dinner before we go in.' Uncle Solomon led the way into the stables, where he lingered to slap his mare on the back and brag about her, and then Mark had to be introduced to the pig. 'What I call a 'andsome pig, you know,' he remarked. 'A perfect picture he is.' A picture that needed cleaning, Mark thought. 'You come down to me in another 3 weeks or so, and we'll try a bit off that chap,' an observation which seemed to strike the pig as in a very indifferent taste, for he shook his ears, grunted, and retired to his sty in a pointed manner. After that there was plenty to do and see before Mark was allowed to dine. Lassie, the collie, had to be unfastened for a run about the grounds, of which a mechanical mouse might have made the tour in 5 minutes. There was a stone obelisk to be inspected that Uncle Solomon had bought a bargain at a sale and set up at a corner of the lawn, inscribed with the names of his favourites living and dead, a remarkably scratch team, by the way. Then he read out sonorous versions of the Latin names of most of his shrubs, which occupied a considerable time, until, at last, by way of the kitchen garden and strawberry beds, they came to a little pond and rustic summer house, near which the boundary fence was unconcealed by any trees or shrubs. 'See that gap?' said Mr. Lightowler, pointing to a paling, of which the lower half was worn away. 'That's where 'Umpage's blathering old gander gets through. I hate the sight of the beast, and I'd sooner have a traction engine running about my beds than him. I've spoken about it to 'Umpage till I'm tired, and I shall have to take the law into my own hands soon, I know I shall. There was Wilcox, my gardener, said something about some way he had to serve him out, but it's come to nothing, and now we'll go in for a wash before dinner.' Uncle Solomon was a widower. A niece of his late wife generally lived with him and superintended his domestic affairs, an elderly person, colourless and cold, who, however, had a proper sense of her position as a decayed relative on the wife's side, and made him negatively comfortable. She was away just then, which was partly the reason why Mark had been invited to bear his uncle company. They dined in a warm little room furnished plainly but well, and after dinner Uncle Solomon gave Mark a cigar, and took down a volume of American commentaries on the Epistles, which he used to give a Sunday tone to his nap. But before it could take effect there were sounds faintly audible through the closed windows, as of people talking at the end of the grounds. Mr. Lightowler opened his drooping eyelids. 'There's someone in my garden,' he said. 'I must go out and put a stop to that. Some of those urchins out of the village, they're always at it.' He put on an old garden hat and sallied out, followed by Mark. 'The voices seem to come down from 'Umpage's way, but there's no one to be seen,' he said as they went along. 'Yes, there is, though. There's 'Umpage himself and his friends looking across the fence at something. What does he want to go staring on to my land for, like his confounded impudence?' When they drew a little nearer, he stopped short and, turning to Mark with a face purple with anger, said, 'Well, of all the impudence! If he isn't egging on that infernal gander now, put him through the hole himself, I dare say.' On arriving at the scene, Mark saw the formidable old gentleman of that morning glaring angrily over the fence. By his side was the fair and slender girl he had seen in church, while at intervals her sister's wondering face appeared above the top of the palings, a small dog uttering short, sharp barks and yelps behind her. They were all looking at a large grey gander, which was unquestionably trespassing at that moment; but it was unjust to say, as Mr. Lightowler had said, that they were giving it any encouragement. The prevailing anxiety seemed to be to recover it, but as the fence was not low, and Mr. Humpage not young enough to care to scale it, they were obliged to wait the good pleasure of the bird. And Mark soon observed that the misguided bird was not in a condition to be easily prevailed upon, being in a very advanced stage of solemn intoxication. It was tacking about the path with an erratic stateliness, its neck stretched defiantly, and its choked, sleepy cackle said, "You let me alone now. I'm all right. Walk straight enough if I want to," as plainly as bird language could render it. As Uncle Solomon bore down on it, it put on an air of elaborate indifference, meant to conceal a retreat to the gap by which it had entered, and began to waddle with excessive dignity in that direction; but from the way in which it repeatedly aimed itself at the intact portions of the paling, it seemed reasonable to infer that it was under a not infrequent optical illusion. Mr. Lightowler gave a short and rather savage laugh. "Wilcox has done it, then," he said. Mark threw away his cigar and slightly lifted his hat as he came up. He felt somewhat ashamed and strongly tempted to laugh at the same time. He dared not look at the face of Mr. Humpage's companion, and kept in the background as a dispassionate spectator. Mr. Lightowler evidently had made up his mind to be as offensive as possible. "Afternoon, Mr. Humpage," he began. "I think I've had the pleasure of seeing this bird of yours before. He's good enough to come in odd times and assist my gardener. You'll excuse me for making the remark, however, but when he's like this I think he ought to be kept indoors." "This is disgraceful, sir," the other gentleman retorted, galled by this irony. "Disgraceful!" "It's not pretty in a gander, I must say," agreed Uncle Solomon, wilfully misunderstanding. "Does it often forget itself in this way now?" "Poor dear Goose!" chanted the little girl, reappearing at this juncture. "It's so giddy. Is it ill, godpa?" "Run away, Dolly," said Mr. Humpage. "It's no sight for you. Run away." "Then Frisk mustn't look either. Come away, Frisk," and Dolly vanished again. When she had gone, the old gentleman said, with a dangerous smile that showed all his teeth, "Now, Mr. Lightowler, I think I'm indebted to you for the abominable treatment of this bird." "Somebody's been treating it, it's very plain," said the other, looking at the bird, which was making a feeble attempt to spread out its wings and screech contemptuously at the universe. "You're equivocating, sir. Do you think I can't see that poison has been laid in your grounds for this unhappy bird?" "It's happy enough, don't you be uneasy, Mr. Humpage. There's been no worse poison given to it than some of my old Glenlivet," said Mr. Lightowler, "and let me tell you, it's not every man, let alone every gander, as gets the luck to taste that. My gardener must have laid some of it down for agricultural purposes, and your bird, coming in through the 'ole, as you may p'raps remember I've spoken to you about before, has been making a little too free with it, that's all. It's welcome as the flowers in May to it, only don't blame me if your bird is laid up with bad headache by and by. Not that there's an headache in the whole cask." At this point Mark could not resist a glance at the fair face across the fence. In spite of her feminine compassion for the bird and respect for its proprietor, Mabel had not been able to overcome a sense of the absurdity of the scene, and the two angry old gentlemen wrangling across the fence over an intoxicated gander. The face Mark saw was rippling with subdued amusement, and her dark grey eyes met his for an instant with an electric flash of understanding. Then she turned away with a slight increase of colour in her cheeks. "I'm going in, Uncle Anthony," she said. "Do come too, as soon as you can. Don't quarrel about it any more. Ask them to give you back your poor goose, and I'll take it into the yard again. It ought to go at once." "Let me manage it my own way," said Mr. Humpage testily. "May I trouble you, Mr. Lightowler, to kindly hand me over that bird when you have quite finished with it?" he added. "That bird has been taking such a fancy to my manure heap that I'll ask to be excused," said Mr. Lightowler. "If you wish to whistle to it now, I might head it through the 'ole, but it always finds it a good deal easier to come through than it does to come back, even when it's sober. I'm afraid you'll have to wait till it comes round a bit." At this the gander lurched against a half buried flower pot, and rolled helplessly over with its eyes closed. "Oh, the poor thing!" cried Mabel. "It's dying!" "D'you see that?" demanded its owner, furiously. "It's dying, and you've had it poisoned, sir. That soaked bread was put there by you, or your orders, and by the Lord you shall pay for it.' 'I never ordered or put it there either,' said his enemy doggedly. 'We shall see about that, we shall see,' said Mr. Humpage. 'You can say that by and by.' 'It's no good losing your temper now. Keep cool, can't you?' roared Uncle Solomon. 'It's likely to make a man cool, isn't it, to come for a quiet stroll on Sunday afternoon to find that his gander has been decoyed into a neighbour's garden and induced to poison itself with whisky? Decoyed? I like that! Pretty innocent, that bird of yours. Too timid to come in without a reg'lar invitation, wasn't he?' jeered Mr. Lightowler. 'Quite had to press him to step in and do the garden up a bit. You and your gander!' Mabel had already escaped. Mark remained trying to persuade his uncle to come away before the matter ceased to be farcical. 'I shall take the matter up, sir, I shall take it up,' said Mr. Humpage in a white rage, 'and I don't think it will do you credit as a churchwarden, let me tell you.' 'Don't you go bringing that in here now,' retorted Uncle Solomon. 'I'll not be spoken to as a churchwarden by you, Mr. 'Umpage, sir, of all parties.' 'You'll not be spoken to by anybody very soon, at any rate as a churchwarden. I mean to bring this affair before the magistrates. I shall take out a summons against you for unlawfully ill-treating and abusing my gander, sir.' 'I tell you I never ill-treated him. As for abuse, I don't say, that's neither here nor there. He ain't so thin-skinned as all that, your gander ain't, and if I choose to put whisky or brandy or champagne cup about my grounds, I'm not obliged to consult your ridic'lous gander, I do 'ope. I didn't ask him to sample them. I don't care a brass button for your summonses. You can summon me till you're black in the face.' But in spite of these brave words, Mr. Lightowler was really not a little alarmed by the threat. 'We shall see about that,' said the other again, viciously. 'And now, once more, will you give me back my poor bird?' Mark thought it had gone far enough. He took up the heavy bird, which made some maudlin objections, and carried it gingerly to the fence. 'Here's the victim, Mr. Humpage,' he said lightly. 'I think it will be itself again in a couple of hours or so. And now, perhaps, we can let the matter drop for the present.' The old gentleman glared at Mark as he received his bird. 'I don't know who you may be, young sir, or what share you've had in this disgraceful business. If I trace it to you, you shall repent of it, I promise you. I don't wish to have any further communication with you or your friend, who's old enough to know his duty better as a neighbour and a Christian. You will let him know, with my compliments, that he'll hear more of this.' He retired with the outraged bird under his arm, leaving Uncle Solomon, who had of course heard his parting words, looking rather ruefully at his nephew. 'It's all very well for you to laugh,' he said to Mark as they turned to go into the house again, 'but let me tell you, if that hot-tempered old idiot goes and brings all this up at Petty Sessions, it may be an awkward affair for me. He's been a lawyer, has 'Umpage, and he'll do his worst. A pretty thing to 'ave my name in all the papers about 'ere as torturing a goose. I dessay they'll try and make out that I poured the whisky down the brute's throat. It's Wilcox's doings and none of mine, and they'll put it all on me. I'll drive over to Green and Ferret's to morrow and see how I stand. You've studied the law, what do you think about it? Come, can he touch me, eh? But he hasn't got a leg to stand on, like his gander. It's all nonsense, ain't it?' If there had ever been a chance, Mark thought bitterly, after comforting his uncle as well as his very moderate acquaintance with the law permitted, of anything like intimacy between himself and the girl whose face had fascinated him so strangely, it was gone now. That bird of evil omen had baulked his hopes as effectually as its ancestors frustrated the aspiring Gaul. The dusk was drawing on as they walked across the lawn, from which the russet glow of the sunset had almost faded. The commonplace villa before them was tinted with violet, and in the west the hedges and trees formed an intricate silhouette against a background of ruddy gold and pale lemon. One or two flamingo-coloured clouds still floated languidly higher up in a greenish blue sky. Over everything the peace and calm had settled that marked the close of a perfect autumn day, with the additional stillness which always makes itself perceptible on a Sunday.
Mark felt the influence of it all, and was vaguely comforted. He remembered the passing interchange of glances across the fence, and it consoled him. At supper that evening his uncle, too, recovered his spirits. 'If he brings a summons they'll dismiss it,' he said confidently, 'but he knows better than that as a lawyer, and if he does, he'll find the laugh turned against him, eh? I'm not answerable for what Wilcox chooses to do without my orders. I never told him he wasn't to, but that ain't like telling him to go and do it, is it now? And where's the cruelty either? A blend like that, too! Just try a glass now and say what you think. He'll be dropping in for more of it if he's the bird I take him for.' But as they were going upstairs to bed, he stopped at the head of the staircase and said to Mark, 'Before I forget it, you remind me to get Wilcox to find out, quietly, the first thing tomorrow, how that gander is.' End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Giant's Robe by F. Anstey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. So near and yet so far. When Mark awoke next morning the weather had undergone one of those sudden and complete changes which form one of the chief attractions of our climate. There had been a frost, and with it a thin white mist, which threw its clinging veil over the landscape. The few trees which were near enough to be seen were covered with a kind of thick grey vegetation, that gave them a spectral resemblance to their summer selves. Breakfast was early, as Mark had to be down at St. Peter's as soon after morning chapel as possible, and he came down shivering to find his uncle already seated. 'The dog cart will be around in 5 minutes,' said the latter gentleman with his mouth full, 'so make the most of your time. You'll have a cold drive. I'll take you over to the station myself, and go on and see Ferret after.' The too zealous Wilcox brought the trap round. 'Have you been round to see that bird next door?' Mr. Lightowler asked rather anxiously, as the man stood by the mare's head. 'Yes, sir,' said Wilcox, with a grin. 'I went and saw Mr. 'Umpage's man, and he said the old gander was wery bad when they got him 'ome, but he ain't any the worse for what he 'ad this morning, sir, though the man, he do say as the gander seemed a bit sorry for herself too. They tough old birds has got strong heads, sir. I knowed it 'ud do him no 'arm, bless ye.' 'Well, don't you go trying it again, Wilcox, that's all. Mind what I say,' said Uncle Solomon, with visible relief, 'else you and me'll have words and part. Let her go,' and they drove off. He gave Mark much good advice on the way, such as wealthy uncles seem to secrete and exude almost unconsciously, as toads yield moisture; but Mark paid only a moderate degree of attention to it as they spun past the low dim edges. He hardly noticed what could be seen along the road even, which was not much a gable end or a haystack starting out for an instant from the fog, or a shadowy labourer letting himself through a gate. He was thinking of the girl whose eyes had met his the afternoon before. He had dreamed of her all that night, a confused ridiculous dream, but with a charm about it which was lingering still. He thought they had met and understood one another at once, and he had taken her to the village church where he had first seen her, and they had a private box, and Uncle Solomon took the chair, while old Mr. Shelford, Trixie, and young Langton were all in the choir, which was more like an orchestra. It was not particularly connected or reverent, but she had not been included in the general travesty. His sleeping brain had respected her image even in its waywardness, and presented it as vivid and charming as in life, so that the dream with all its absurdity seemed to have brought her nearer to him, and he could not resist the fancy that she might have some recollection of it too. A low hum in the still air, and distant reports and choked railway whistles told them they were near the station, but the fog had grown so much denser that there was no other indication of it, until Mr. Lightowler brought up sharply opposite the end of an inclined covered staircase, which seemed to spring out of nothing and lead nowhere, where they left the dog-cart in charge of a flyman and went up to the platform. There a few old gentlemen with rosy faces were stamping up and down and slapping their chests, exchanging their 'raw morning this, sirs,'
"Ah, it is indeed," with an air of good men bearing up under an undeserved persecution. "Sharp morning this is to stand about in," said Uncle Solomon. "Let's go into the waiting room, there's a fire there." The waiting room was the usual drab little room, with a bottle of water and tumblers on a bare stained table, and local advertisements on the dingy walls. The gas was lighted, and flickered in a sickly white fishtail flame, but the fire was blazing cheerfully, giving a sheen to the silver grey fur of a child in a crimson plush hat, who stood before it embracing a small round basket out of which a Skye terrier's head was peering inquisitively. The firelight shone, too, on the graceful form of a girl, who was bending towards it, holding out her slender hands to the blaze. Mark scarcely needed to glance at the face as she turned towards the newcomers to recognise that fortune had allowed him one more chance. Mr. Humpage's visitors were evidently returning to town by the same train as himself, and the old gentleman in person was standing with his back to them examining a timetable on the wall. Uncle Solomon, in his relief at Wilcox's information that morning, did not perceive any awkwardness in the encounter, but moved about and coughed noisily, as if anxious to attract his enemy's attention. Mark felt considerably embarrassed, dreading a scene, but he glanced as often as he dared at the lady of his thoughts, who was drawing on her gloves again with a dainty deliberation. "Godpapa," said the little girl suddenly, "you never told me if Frisk had been good. Has he?" "So good that he kept me awake thinking of him all night," said the old gentleman drily, without turning. "Did he howl, godpapa? He does sometimes when he's left out in the garden, you know." "He did," said Mr. Humpage. "Oh yes, he howled. He's a clever dog at that." "And you really like him to?" said Dolly. "Some people don't." "Narrow-minded of 'em, very," growled the old gentleman. "Isn't it?" said Dolly innocently. "Well, I'm glad you like it, godpapa, because now I shall bring him to see you again. When there's a moon he can howl much louder. I'll bring him when the next moon comes, shall I?" "We'll see, Chuckie, we'll see. I shouldn't like to keep him sitting up all night to howl on my account. It wouldn't be good for his health. But the very next blue moon we have down in these parts I'll send up for him, I promise you that." Dolly was evidently about to inquire searchingly into the nature of this local phenomenon, but before she could begin the old gentleman turned and saw that they were not alone. "Morning, Mr. 'Umpage," said Uncle Solomon, clearing his throat, and Mark felt a pang of regret for the lost aspirate. "Good morning to you, sir," said the other distantly. The elder girl returned the bow which Mark risked, though without giving any sign of remembrance. But Dolly remarked audibly, "Why, that's the old man next door that gave your goose something to make it giddy, isn't it, godpapa?" "I hope," said Uncle Solomon, "that now you've had time to think over what 'appened yesterday afternoon, you'll see that you went too far in using the terms that fell from you, more particularly as the bird's as well as ever, from what I hear this morning." "I don't wish to reopen that affair at present," said the other stiffly. "Well, I've heard about enough of it too, so if you'll own you used language that was unwarrantable, I'm willing to say no more about it on my part." "I've no doubt you are, Mr. Lightowler, but you must excuse me for entering into any conversation on the subject. I can't dismiss it as lightly as you seem to do, and, in short, I don't mean to discuss it here, sir." "Very well, just as you please. I only meant to be neighbourly, but it don't signify. I can keep myself to myself as well as other parties, I dare say." "Then you'll have the goodness to do it, Mr. Lightowler. Mabel, the train is due now. Get your wraps and things and come along." He walked fiercely past the indignant Uncle Solomon, followed by Mabel and Dolly, the former of whom seemed a little ashamed of Mr. Humpage's behaviour, for she kept her eyes lowered as she passed Mark, while Dolly looked up at him with childish curiosity. "Confound these old fools!" thought Mark angrily. "What do they want to squabble for in this ridiculous way? Why, if they had only been on decent terms, I might have been introduced to her, to Mabel, by this time,
We might even have travelled up to town together."
"Regular old Tartar, that," said his uncle under his breath. "I believe he'll try and have the law of me now. Let him, I don't care. Here's your train at last. You won't be in by the timetable this morning with all this fog about."
Mark got into a compartment next to that in which Mr. Humpage had put Mabel and her sister. It was as near as he dared to venture. He could hear Mabel's clear soft voice saying the usual last words at the carriage window, while Uncle Solomon was repeating his exhortation to study and abstinence from any literary nonsense. Then the train, after one or two false starts on the greasy rails, moved out, and Mark had a parting glimpse of the neighbours turning sharply round on the platform with an elaborate affectation of being utter strangers. He had no paper to amuse him, for the station was not important enough for a bookstall, and there was nothing to be seen out of the windows, which were silvered with frozen moisture. He had the compartment to himself, and lay back looking up rather sentimentally at the bull's eye, through which he heard occasional snatches of Dolly's imperious treble. "I know her name now," he thought, with a quite unreasonable joy. "Mabel, I shall remember that. I wonder if they are going all the way to town, and if I could offer to be of any use to them at King's Cross. At all events, I shall see her once more then." It was not a very long journey from Chigbourne to the terminus, but, as will be seen hereafter, it was destined to be a landmark in the lives of both Mark and Mabel, though the meeting he looked forward to at the end of it never took place. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Giant's Robe by F. Anstey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. In the Fog. Mark was roused from his reverie in the railway carriage by the fact that the train, after slackening speed rather suddenly, had come to a dead standstill. "Surely we can't be in already," he said to himself, wondering at the way in which his thoughts had outstripped the time. But on looking out he found that he was mistaken. They were certainly not near the metropolis as yet, nor did they appear to have stopped at any station, though from the blank white fog which reigned all around, and drifted in curling wreaths through the window he had let down, it was difficult to make very sure of this. Along the whole length of the train conversation, no longer drowned by the motion, rose and fell in a kind of drone, out of which occasional scraps of talk from the nearer carriages were more distinctly audible, until there came a general lull as each party gave way to the temptation of listening to the other, for the dullest talk has an extraordinary piquancy under these circumstances, either because the speakers, being unseen, appeal to our imagination, or because they do not suppose that they are being so generally overheard. But by and by it seemed to be universally felt that the stoppage was an unusual one, and windows went down with a clatter along the carriages while heads were put out inquiringly. Every kind of voice demanded to be told where they were, and why they were stopping, and what the deuce the company meant by it. Inquiries met by a guard, who walked slowly along the line, with the diplomatic evasiveness which marks the official dislike to admit any possible hitch in the arrangements. "Yes," he said stolidly, "there might be a bit of a stoppage like. They'd be going on presently. He couldn't say how long that would be. Something had gone wrong with the engine. It was nothing serious. He didn't exactly know what." But he was met just under Mark's window by the guard from the break at the end of the train, when a hurried conference took place, in which there was no stolidity on either side. "Run back as quick as you can and set the detonators. There ain't a minute to lose. She may be down on us any time, and she'll never see the other signals this weather. I'd get 'em all out of the train if I was you, mate. They ain't safe where they are as it is, that they ain't." The one guard ran back to his break, and then on to set the fog signals, while the other went to warn the passengers. "All get out 'ere, please, all get out!" he shouted. There was the usual obstructive person in the train who required to be logically convinced first of the necessity of disturbing himself. He put his head angrily out of a window near Mark's. "Here, guard!" he shouted importantly. "What's all this? Why am I to get out?"
'Because you'd better,' said the guard shortly. 'But why? Where's the platform? I insist on being taken to a platform. I'm not going to break my leg getting out here.' Several people, who had half opened their doors, paused on the steps at this, as if recalled to a sense of their personal dignity. 'Do as you please, sir,' said the official. 'The engine's broke down, and we may be run into any minute in this fog, but if you'd be more comfortable up there—' There was no want of alacrity after that. The obstructive man being the first down, all the rosy-faced gentlemen hopped out, some of the younger ones still grasping half-played hands of Nap or Loo, and made the best of their way down the embankment, and several old ladies were got out in various stages of flutter, narrowly escaping sprained ankles in the descent. Mark, who had seen his opportunity from the first, had rushed to the door of the next compartment, caught Dolly in his arms as she jumped down, and, hardly believing in his own good fortune, held Mabel's hand in his for one happy moment as she stepped from the high and awkward footboard. 'Down the slope, quick!' he cried to them. 'Get as far from the line as you can, in case of a smash.' Mabel turned a little pale, for she had not understood till then that there was any real danger. 'Keep close to me, Dolly,' she said, as they went down the slope. 'We're safe here.' The fog had gathered thick down in the meadows, and nothing could be seen of the abandoned train when they had gone a few paces from the foot of the embankment. The passengers were moving about in excited groups, not knowing what horrors they might not be obliged to witness in the next few minutes. The excitement increased as one of them declared he could hear the noise of an approaching train. 'Only just in time. God help them if they don't pull up!' cried some, and a woman hoped that 'the poor driver and stoker were not on the engine.' Dolly heard this, and broke from Mabel with a loud cry. 'Mabel, we've left Frisk!' she sobbed. 'He'll be killed! Oh, my dog will be killed! He mustn't be left behind!' And, to Mark's horror, she turned back, evidently with the idea of making for the point of danger. He ran after her, and caught the little silvery grey form fast in his arms. 'Let me go!' cried Dolly, struggling. 'I must get him back! Oh, I must!' 'He'll have jumped out by this time. He's quite safe,' said Mark in her ear. 'He was sound asleep in his basket. He'll never wake if I don't call to him. Why do you hold me? I tell you I will go!' persisted Dolly. 'No, Dolly, no,' said Mabel, bending over her. 'It's too late. It's hard to leave him, but we must hope for the best.' She was crying too for the poor doomed dog as she spoke. Mark was hardly a man from whom anything heroic could be very confidently expected. He was no more unselfish than the generality of young men; as a rule, he disliked personally inconveniencing himself for other people, and in cooler moments, or without the stimulus of Mabel's presence, he would certainly have seen no necessity to run the risk of a painful death for the sake of a dog. But Mabel was there, and the desire of distinguishing himself in her eyes made a temporary hero out of materials which at first sight were not promising. He was physically fearless enough, and given to acting on impulses without counting the consequences. The impulse seized him now to attempt to rescue this dog, and he obeyed it blindly. 'Wait here,' he said to Mabel. 'I'll go back for him.' 'Oh, no, no!' she cried. 'It may cost you your life.' 'Don't stop him, Mabel,' entreated Dolly. 'He is going to save my dog.' Mark had gone already, and was half way up the slope, slippery as it was, with the grass clumped and matted together by the frost, and scored in long brown tracks by the feet that had just descended it. Mabel was left to console and encourage the weeping Dolly as best she might, with a terrible suspense weighing on her own heart the while, not altogether on Frisk's account. At the point where the train had broken down, the line took a bold curve, and now they could hear, apparently close upon them, the roar of a fast train sweeping round through the fog. There were some faint explosions, hoarse shouting, a long screeching whistle, and after that the dull shock of a collision, but nothing could be seen from where they stood, and for some moments Mabel remained motionless, almost paralysed by the fear of what might be hidden behind the fog curtain. Mark clambered painfully up the glistening embankment, hoping to reach the motionless carriages and escape with his object effected before the train he could hear in the distance ground into them with a hideous crash. He knew his danger, but, to do him justice, he scarcely gave it a thought. Any possible suffering seemed as remote and inconsiderable just then as the chance of a broken leg or collarbone had been to him when running for a touchdown in his football days. The one idea that filled his brain was to return to Mabel triumphant with the rescued dog in his arms, and he had room for no others. He went as directly as he could to the part of the train in which was the carriage he had occupied, and found it without much difficulty when he was near enough to make out forms through the fog. The door to Mabel's compartment was open, and as he sprang up the footboard he heard the train behind rattling down on him with its whistle screeching infernally, and for the first time felt an uneasy recollection of the horribly fantastic injuries described in accounts of so many railway collisions. But there was no time to think of this. At the other end of the carriage was the little round wicker basket he had seen in Dolly's hands at the Chigbourne waiting room, and in it was the terrier, sleeping soundly as she had anticipated. He caught up the little drowsy beast, which growled ungratefully, and turned to leap down with it to the ballast, when there was a sharp concussion, which sent a jangling forward shock, increasing in violence as it went, along the standing train, and threw him violently against the partition of the compartment. Meanwhile the passengers of the first train, now that the worst was apparently over, and the faint shouts and screams from the embankment had calmed down, began to make their way in the direction of the sounds, and Mabel, holding Dolly fast by the hand, forced herself to follow them, though she was sick and faint with the dread of what she might see. The first thing they saw was a crowd of eager excited faces all questioning and accusing the badgered officials of both trains at the same time. Why was an empty train left on the rails unprotected in this way? They might have been all killed. It was culpable negligence all round, and there should be an inquiry. They would insist on an inquiry. They would report this to the traffic manager, and so on. The faces looked pale and ghastly enough in the fog, but all the speakers were evidently sound in wind and limb, and, as far as could be seen, neither train had left the rails. But where was the young man who had volunteered to recover the dog? 'Oh, Mabel!' cried Dolly again and again. 'Frisk is killed, I'm sure of it, or he'd come to me. Something has happened. Ask, do ask!' But Mabel dared not, for fear of hearing that a life had been nobly and uselessly sacrificed. She could only press through the crowd with the object of making her way to the carriage where the suspense would be ended. 'There's someone in one of the carriages,' she heard a voice saying as she got nearer, and her heart beat faster, and then the crowd parted somehow, and she saw Mark Ashburn come out of it towards her, with a dazed, scared smile on his pale face, and the little trembling dog safe under one arm. Fortunately for Mark, the fog signals had been set in time to do their work, and the second train was fitted with powerful brakes, which, but for the state of the rails, would have brought it to without any collision at all. As it was, the shock had not been severe enough to damage the rolling stock to any greater extent than twisting or straining a buffer or coupling chain here and there, though it had thrown him against the corner of the net rail with sufficient violence to slightly graze his forehead, and leave him stunned and a little faint for a few moments. After sitting down for a short time to recover himself, he picked up the terrier from the cushions on which it was crouching and shivering, having dropped from his hand at the concussion, and feeling himself still rather giddy and sick, got down amongst the astonished crowd and came towards Mabel and Dolly, as we have seen. It was the best moment, as he thought afterwards, in his life. Everyone, probably, with any imagination at all, likes to conceive himself at times as the performer of some heroic action, extorting the admiration he longs for from some particular pair of eyes, but opportunities for thus distinguishing oneself are sadly rare nowadays, and often, when they come, are missed, or if grasped with success, the fair eyes are looking another way and never see it. But Mark had a satisfied sense of appearing to the utmost advantage as he met the little girl and placed the dog in her arms. "There's your dog, he's quite safe, only a little frightened," he said, with a pleasant sympathy in his voice. Dolly was too overcome for words. She caught Frisk up with her eyes swimming, and ran away with him to pour her self-reproach and relief into his prickled ears, without making any attempt to express her thanks to his rescuer. Her sister, however, made him ample amends. "How can we thank you?" she said, with a quiver in her voice and an involuntary admiration in her eyes. "It was so very, very brave of you. You might have been killed." "I thought at first it was going to be rather a bad smash," said Mark. He could not resist the impulse now to make all the capital he could out of what he had done. "I was knocked down and unconscious for a while after it, but I'm not much hurt, as you see. I don't think I'm any the worse for it, and at all events your little sister's dog isn't, and that's the main point, isn't it?" he added, with a feeling that his words were equal to the occasion. "Indeed it isn't," said Mabel warmly. "If you had been seriously hurt I should never have forgiven myself for letting you go. But are you sure you feel no pain anywhere?" "Well," he admitted, "I fancy I was cut a little about the head." He was afraid she might not have noticed this, "but that's a trifle." "There is a cut on your forehead," said Mabel. "It has been bleeding, but I think it has stopped now. Let me bind it up for you, in case it should break out again." It was, in truth, a very small cut, and had hardly bled at all, but Mark made light of it elaborately, as the surest means of keeping her interest alive. "I'm afraid it must be giving you pain," she said, with a pretty anxious concern in her eyes as she spoke, and Mark protested that the pain was nothing, which was the exact truth, although he had no intention of being taken literally. They had gone down the embankment again and were slowly crossing the dim field in which they had first taken refuge. No one was in sight, the other passengers being still engaged in comparing notes or browbeating the unhappy guards above, and as Mark glanced at his companion he saw that her thoughts had ceased to busy themselves about him, while her eyes were trying to pierce the gloom which surrounded her. "I was looking for my little sister," she exclaimed, answering the question in his eyes. "She ran off with the dog you brought back to her, and it is so easy to lose oneself here. I must find out where she is. Oh, you are ill!" she broke off suddenly, as Mark staggered and half fell. "Only a slight giddiness," he said. "If I could sit down somewhere for a moment. Is that a stile over there?" "It looks like one. Can you get so far without help?" she said compassionately. "Will you lean on me?" He seemed to her like some young knight who had been wounded, as it were, in her cause, and deserved all the care she could give him. "If you will be so very good," said Mark. He felt himself a humbug, for he could have leaped the stile with ease at that very moment. He had very little excuse for practising in this way on her womanly sympathy, except that he dreaded to lose her just yet, and found such a subtle intoxication in being tended like this by a girl from whom an hour ago he had scarcely hoped to win another careless glance. If he exaggerated his symptoms, as it is to be feared he did, there may be some who will forgive him under the circumstances. So he allowed Mabel to guide him to the stile, and sat down on one of its rotten cross planks, while she poured eau de cologne or some essence of the kind on a handkerchief and ordered him to bathe his forehead with it. They seemed isolated there together on the patch of hoary grass by a narrow black ditch half hidden in rank weeds, which alone could be distinguished in the prevailing yellowish whiteness, and Mark desired nothing better at the moment. "I wonder," said Mabel, "if there's a doctor amongst the passengers. There must be, I should think. I am sure you ought to see one. Let me see if I can find one and bring him to you." But Mark declared he was quite himself again, and would have begged her not to leave him if he had dared.
and as there really did not seem to be anything serious the matter, Mabel's uneasiness about Dolly returned. "I can't rest till I find her," she said, "and if you really are strong again, will you help me? She cannot have gone far." Mark, only too glad of any pretence to remain with her, volunteered willingly. "Then will you go round the field that way," she said, "and I will go this, and we will meet here again." "Don't you think," said Mark, who had not been prepared for this, "that if she might not know me, you see I mean if I was not with you." "Yes, she will," said Mabel impatiently. "Dolly won't forget you after what you have done, and we are losing time. Go round by there and call her now and then, and if she is here she will come, and if she is not, then we will try the next field." She went off herself as she spoke, and Mark had nothing for it but to obey, as she so evidently expected to be obeyed. He went round the field, calling out the child's name now and then, feeling rather forlorn and ridiculous as his voice went out unanswered on the raw air. Presently a burly figure, grotesquely magnified by the mist, came towards him and resolved itself into an ordinary guard. "You one of the gentlemen in my train, sir?" he said. "The train has broke down, that is." "Yes," said Mark. "Why?" "'Cause we got the engine put to rights, sir. Nothing much the matter with her, there wasn't, and we're going on directly, sir. I'm getting all my passengers together." Mark was in no hurry to leave that field, but his time was not his own. He ought to have been at St. Peter's long ago, and was bound to take the first opportunity of getting back. It would not be pleasant, as it was, to have to go and fetch down his class from the sixth form room, where the headmaster had probably given them a temporary asylum. He had never forgotten a morning on which he had overslept himself, and the mortification he had felt at the doctor's blandly polite but cutting reception of his apologies. He had a better excuse this time, but even that would not bear overtaxing. He hesitated a moment, however. "I'll go in a minute," he said, "but there's a lady and a little girl with a dog somewhere about. They mustn't be left behind. Wait while I go and tell them, will you?" "Never you fear, sir," said the guard. "We won't go without them, but I'll call 'em. They'll mind me more than they will you, begging your pardon, sir, and you'd better run on, as time's short, and keep places for 'em. You leave it all to me. I'll take care on 'em." Mark heard faint barks across the hedge in the direction Mabel had taken. The child was evidently found. The best thing, he thought, to do now was to secure an empty compartment, and with that idea, and perhaps a little from that instinctive obedience to anything in a uniform which is a characteristic of the average respectable Englishman, he let himself be persuaded by the guard and went back to the train. To his great joy he found that the compartment Mabel had occupied had no one in it. He stood waiting by the door for Mabel and her sister to come up, with eager anticipations of delightful conclusion to his journey. "Perhaps she will tell me who she is," he thought. "At all events she will ask me who I am. How little I hoped for this yesterday!" He was interrupted by another guard, a sour looking man with a grizzled beard, who was in charge of the front van. "Get in, sir, if you mean to travel by this here train," he said. "I'm waiting for a young lady," said Mark, rather ingenuously, but it slipped out almost without his knowledge. "The other guard promised me—" "I don't know nothing about no young ladies," said the guard obdurately, "but if you mean my mate, he's just given me the signal from his end, and if you don't want to be left be'ind, you'd better take your seat while you can, sir, and pretty sharp too." There was nothing else to do. He could not search for Mabel along the train. He must wait till they got to King's Cross, but he took his seat reluctantly and with a heavy disappointment, thinking what a fool he had been to let himself be persuaded by the burly guard. "But for that, she might have been sitting opposite to me now," he thought bitterly. "What a fool I was to leave her! How pretty she looked when she wanted me to see a doctor! How charming she is altogether! Am I in love with her already? Of course I am, who wouldn't be? I shall see her again. She will speak to me once more, and, after all, things might be worse. I couldn't have counted on that when we started." And he tried to console himself with this, feeling an impatient anger at the slow pace of the train as it crept cautiously on towards the goal of his hopes. But the breakdown had not happened very far from town, and, tedious as the time seemed to Mark,
It was not actually long before the colour of the atmosphere (there was no other indication) proved that they were nearing the terminus. It changed by slow gradations from its original yellow whiteness to mustard colour, and from that to a smoky lurid red, and from red to stinging choking iron grey, and the iron grey pall was in full possession of King's Cross, where the sickly moonlight of the electric lamps could only clear small halos immediately around their globes. Mark sprang out before the train had stopped. He strained his eyes in watching for the form he hoped to see there, but in vain. There were no signs in all that bustle of Mabel or Dolly or the little dog to whom he owed so much. He sought out the guard who had deluded him and found him superintending the clearing of the luggage van. He hardly knew whether it was merely a fancy that the official, after making a half step forward to meet him, and fumbling in all his pockets, turned away again as if anxious to avoid meeting his eye. Mark forced him to meet him, however, willing or not. "Where is the lady?" he said sharply. "You left her behind after all, it seems." "It wasn't my fault, sir," said the guard wheezily, "nor was it the lady's fault, leastways only the little lady's, sir. Both on us tried all we could, but the little missy, her with the tarrier dawg, was nervous like with it all, and wouldn't hear of getting in the train again. So the young lady, she said, seeing as they were so near London, they could get a fly or a cab or summat, and go on in that." "And did she give you no message for me?" said Mark. There was such evident expectation in his face that the guard seemed afraid to disappoint it. "I was to give you her respects and compliments," he said slowly. "Or was it her love, now?" he substituted quickly, after a glance at Mark's face. "And you was not to be in a way about her, and she'd be seeing of you again before very long, and——" "That's all a lie, you know," said Mark calmly. "Well, then, she didn't say nothing, if that warn't it," said the guard doggedly. "Did she leave any directions about luggage or anything?" said Mark. "Brown portmanty to go in the left luggage room till called for," said the guard. "Anything else I can do for you, sir? No? Good morning, then, and thankee, sir." "Never did such a thing as that in my life afore," he muttered, as he went back to his van. "To go and lose a bit of paper with writing on it, directly I got it too! I'm afraid my head's a leaving me. They ain't keeping company, that's plain. I made a mess of that, or he wouldn't have wanted her direction. I saw what he was up to. Well, they'd make a good looking pair. I'm sorry I lost that there paper, but it weren't no use a telling of him." As for Mark, this lame and impotent conclusion brought back all his depression again. "She never even asked my name," he thought bitterly. "I risked my life for her. It was for her, and she knew it. But she has forgotten that already. I've lost her for ever this time. She may not even live in London, and if she did I've no clue to tell me where, and if I had I don't exactly see what use it would be. I won't think about it. Yes, I will. She can't prevent me from doing that at any rate." By this time he had left the City station of the Metropolitan Railway, and was going back to his underground labours at St. Peter's, where he was soon engaged in trying to establish something like discipline in his class, which the dark brown fog seemed to have inspired with unaccountable liveliness. His short holiday had not served to rest and invigorate him as much as might have been expected. It had left him consumed with a hopeless longing for something unattainable. His thirst for distinction had returned in an aggravated form, and he had cut himself off now from the only means of slaking it. As that day wore on, and with each day that succeeded it, he felt a wearier disgust with himself and his surroundings. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Giant's Robe by F. Anstey. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Bad News. It was Christmas week, and Mrs. Langton and her daughters were sitting, late one afternoon, in the drawing room where we saw them first. Dolly was on a low stool at her mother's feet, submitting, not too willingly, to have the bow in her hair smoothed and arranged for her. "It must be all right now, mother," she said, breaking away rebelliously at last. "It's worse than ever, Dolly," said Mrs. Langton plaintively.
It's slipped over to the left now." "But it doesn't matter. It never will keep straight long." "Well, if you like to run about like a little wild child," was the resigned answer. "Little wild children don't wear bows in their hair. They wear—well, they don't wear anything they've got to be careful and tidy about. I think that must be rather nice," said Dolly, turning round from where she knelt on the hearthrug. "Wake up, Frisk, and be good-tempered directly. Mother, on Christmas Day I'm going to tie a Christmas card round Frisk's neck, and send him into papa's dressing-room to wish him a Merry Christmas the first thing in the morning. You won't tell him before the time, will you?" "Not if you don't wish it, darling," said Mrs. Langton placidly. "I mightn't have had him to tie a card to," said Dolly, taking the dog up and hugging him fondly, "if that gentleman had not fetched him out of the train for me, and I never said thank you to him either. I forgot somehow, and when I remembered he was gone. Should you think he will come to see me, Mabel? You told him that mother would be glad to thank him sometime, didn't you, on the paper you gave the guard for him?" "Yes, Dolly," said Mabel, turning her head a little way, "but you see he hasn't come yet." "My dear," said the mother, "really I think he shows better taste in keeping away. There was no necessity to send him a message at all, and I hope he won't take any advantage of it. Thanking people is so tiresome, and, after all, they never think you have said enough about it. It was very kind of the young man, of course, very, though I can't say I ever quite understood what it was he did. It was something in a fog, I know," she concluded vaguely. "We told you all about it, mother," explained Dolly. "I'll tell you all over again. There was a fog, and our train stopped, and we all got out, and I left Frisk behind, and there he was in the carriage all alone, and then the gentleman ran back and got him out and brought him to me, and another train came up behind and stopped too." "Dolly tells it rather tamely," said Mabel, her cheeks flushing again. "At the time he ran back for the dog, we could all hear the other train rushing up in the fog, mamma, and nobody knew whether there might not be a frightful collision in another minute." "Then I think it was an extremely rash thing for him to do, my dear, and if I were his mother I should be very angry with him." "He was very good looking, wasn't he, Mabel?" said Dolly irrelevantly. "Was he, Dolly? Well, yes, I suppose he was rather," said Mabel, with much outward indifference, and an inward and very vivid picture of Mark's face as he leaned by the stile, his fine eyes imploring her not to leave him. "Well, perhaps he doesn't care about being thanked, or doesn't want to see us again," said Dolly. "If he did, he'd call, you know. You wrote the address on the paper." Mabel had already arrived at the same conclusion, and was secretly a little piqued and hurt by it. She had gone slightly out of her way to give him an opportunity of seeing her again if he wished, and he had chosen not to take advantage of it. It had not seriously disturbed her peace of mind, but her pride was wounded notwithstanding. At times she was ready to believe that there had been some mistake or miscarriage with her message, otherwise it was strange that the admiration which it had not been difficult to read in his eyes should have evaporated in this way. "Why, here's papa home already!" cried Dolly, as the door opened and a tall man entered. "How d'you do, papa? You've rumpled my bow. You didn't think I meant it, did you? You can do it again if you like. I don't mind a bit. Mother does." He had duly returned the affectionate hug with which Dolly had greeted him, but now he put her aside with a rather preoccupied air, and went to his wife's chair, kissing the smooth forehead she presented, still absently. "You are early, Gerald," she said. "Did the courts rise sooner to day?" "No," he said conscientiously. "It's the vacation now. I left chambers as soon as I could get away." And he was folding and unfolding the evening paper he had brought in with him, as he stood silent before the fire. Mr. Langton was not much over 50, and a handsome man still, with full clear eyes, a well-cut chin and mouth, iron grey whiskers, and a florid complexion, which years spent in stifling law courts and dust and black laden chambers had not done much to tone down.
Young barristers and solicitors' clerks were apt to consider him rather a formidable personage in Lincoln's Inn, and he was certainly imposing as he rustled along New Square or Chancery Lane, his brows knitted, a look of solemn importance about his tightly closed lips, and his silk gown curving out behind him like a great black sail. He had little imperious ways in court, too, of beckoning a client to come to him from the well, or of waving back a timid junior who had plucked his gown to draw his attention to some suggestion with a brusque "Not now, I can't hear that now," which suggested immeasurable gulfs between himself and them. But at home he unbent, a little consciously perhaps, but he did unbend, being proud and fond of his children, who at least stood in no fear of him. Long years of successful practice had had a certain narrowing effect upon him. The things of his profession were almost foremost in his mind now, and when he travelled away from them he was duller than he once promised to be. His humour had slowly dwindled down until it had just sufficient for ordinary professional purposes, and none at all for private consumption. In his favour it may be added that he was genial to all whom he did not consider his inferiors, a good though not a demonstrative husband; that as a lawyer he was learned without the least pedantry, and that he was a bencher of his inn, where he frequently dined, and a member of Parliament, where he never spoke, even on legal matters. Mabel's quick eyes were the first to notice a shade on his face and a constraint in his manner. She went to his side and said in an undertone, "You are not feeling ill, papa, are you? Or has anything worried you today?" "I am quite well. I have news to tell you presently," he said in the same tone. "Come and see my Christmas cards before I do them up," said Dolly from a side table. "I'm going to send one to each of my friends, except Clara Haycroft, or if I do send her one," she added thoughtfully, "it will be only a penny one, and I shall write her name on the back so that she can't use it again. Clara has not behaved at all well to me lately. If I sent one to Vincent now, papa, would he get it in time?" "No, no," said her father a little sharply. "And look here, Pussy, run away now and see how Colin is getting on." "And come back and tell you?" inquired Dolly. "Very well, papa." "Don't come back till I send for you," he said. "Mind that now, Dolly, stay in the schoolroom." He shut the door carefully after her, and then turning to his wife and daughter, he said, "You haven't either of you seen the papers today, I suppose?" "No," said Mrs. Langton. "You know I never read daily papers." "Gerald," she cried suddenly, with a light coming into her eyes, "is another judge dead?" Visions of her husband on the bench, a town house in a more central part of London, an increase of social consideration for herself and daughters, began to float into her brain. "It's not that. If there was, I'm not likely to be offered a judgeship just yet. It's not good news, Belle. I'm afraid it's very bad," he said warningly, "very bad indeed." "Oh, papa!" cried Mabel, "please don't break it to us. Tell it at once, whatever it is." "You must let me choose my own course, my dear. I am coming to the point at once. The Globe has a telegram from Lloyd's agent reporting the total loss of the Mangalore." "Vincent's ship!" said Mabel. "Is he saved?" "We cannot be certain of anything just yet, and these disasters are generally exaggerated in the first accounts, but I'm afraid there is very grave reason to fear that the poor boy went down with her. Not many passengers were on board at the time, and only 4 or 5 of them were saved, and they are women. We can hope for the best still, but I cannot, after reading the particulars, feel any confidence myself. I made inquiries at the owners' offices this afternoon, but they could tell me very little just yet, though they will have fuller information by tomorrow. But from what they say, I cannot feel very hopeful." Mabel hid her face, trying to realise that the man who had sat opposite to her there scarcely a month ago, with the strange, almost prophetic sadness in his eyes, was lying somewhere still and white, fathoms deep under the sea. She was too stunned for tears just yet. "Gerald," said Mrs. Langton, "Vincent is drowned, I'm sure of it. I feel this will be a terrible shock to me by and by. I don't know when I shall get over it. Poor, poor dear fellow! To think that the last time I saw him was that evening we dined at the Gordons'. You remember, Gerald, a dull dinner, and he saw me into the carriage and stood there on the pavement saying good-bye." Mrs. Langton seemed to consider that these circumstances had a deep pathos of their own. She pressed her eyes daintily with her handkerchief before she could go on. "Why didn't he sail by one of the safe lines?" she murmured. "The P. & O. never lost a single life. He might have gone in one of them and been alive now." "My dear Belle," said her husband, "we can't foresee these things. It was to be, I suppose." "Is nothing more known?" said Mabel, with a strong effort to control her voice. "Here is the account. Stay, I can give you the effect of it. It was in the Indian Ocean, not long after leaving Bombay, somewhere off the Malabar coast, and the ship seems to have grazed a sunken reef, which ripped a fearful hole in her side without stopping her course. They were not near enough to the land to hope to reverse the engines and back her on shore at full speed. She began to settle down fast by the head, and their only chance was in the boats, which unfortunately had nearly all become jammed in the davits. Everyone appears to have behaved admirably. They managed at last to launch one of the boats and to put the women into it, and they were trying to get out the others, when the vessel went down suddenly, not a quarter of an hour after striking the reef." "Vincent could swim, papa," said Mabel, with gleaming eyes. "He was not a first-rate swimmer," said Mr. Langton. "I remember that, and even a first-rate swimmer would have found it hard work to reach the shore, if he had not been drawn down with the ship, as seems to have been the fate of most of the poor fellows. Still, of course, there is always hope." "And he is dead, Vincent dead. It seems so hard, so very, very sad," said Mabel, and began to cry softly. "Cry, darling," said Mrs. Langton. "It will do you good. I'm sure I wish I could cry like that. It would be such a relief. But you know papa says we may hope yet. We won't give up all hope till we're obliged to. We must be brave. You really don't care about coming in to dinner? You won't have a little something sent up to your room? Well, I feel as if food would choke me myself, but I must go in to keep papa company. Will you tell this sad news to Dolly and Colin, and ask Fräulein to keep them with her till bedtime? I can't bear to see them just yet." Mr. Langton's decorous concern did not interfere with his appetite, and Mrs. Langton seemed rather relieved at being able to postpone her grief for the present, and so Mabel was left to break the disaster, and the fate there was too much reason to fear for Vincent, to her younger brother and sister, a painful task, for Holroyd had been very dear to all three of them. Fräulein Moser, too, wept with a more than sentimental sorrow for the young man she had tried to help, who would need her assistance never again. The tidings had reached Mark early that same afternoon. He was walking home through the city from some holiday classes he had been superintending at St. Peter's, when the heading 'Loss of a passenger steamer with lives' on the contents sheet of the evening papers caught his eyes, and led him, when established with the Globe in one of the Underground Railway carriages, to turn with a languid interest to the details. He started when he saw the name of the vessel, and all his indifference left him as he hurriedly read the various accounts of the disaster, and looked in vain for Vincent's name amongst the survivors. The next day he, too, went up to the owner's offices to make inquiries, and by that time full information had come in, which left it impossible that any but those who had come ashore in the long boat could have escaped from the ship. They had remained near the scene of the wreck for some time, but without picking up more than one or two of the crew. The rest must all have been sucked down with the ship, which sank with terrible suddenness at the last. Vincent was certainly not amongst those in the boat, while, as appeared from the agent's list, he was evidently on board when the ship left Bombay. It was possible to hope no longer after that, and Mark left the offices with the knowledge that Holroyd and he had indeed taken their last walk together, that he would see his face and take his hand no more. It came to him with a shock, the unavoidable shock which a man feels when he has suddenly to associate the idea of death with one with whom he has had any intimacy. He told himself he was sorry, and for a moment Vincent's fate seemed somehow to throw a sort of halo round his memory. But very soon the sorrow faded, until at last it became little more than an uneasy consciousness that he ought to be miserable and was not. Genuine grief will no more come at command than genuine joy, and so Mark found, not without some self-reproach. He even began to read In Memoriam again, with the idea of making that the keynote for his emotions, but the passionate yearning of that lament was pitched too high for him, and he never finished it. He recognised that he could not think of his lost friend in the way their long intimacy seemed to demand, and solved the difficulty by not thinking of him at all, compounding for his debt of inward mourning by wearing a black tie which, as he was fond of a touch of colour in his costume, and as the emblem in question was not strictly required of him, he looked upon as, so to speak, a fairly respectable dividend. Caffyn heard the news with a certain satisfaction. A formidable rival had been swept out of his path, and he could speak of him now without any temptation to depreciate his merits, so much so that when he took an opportunity one day of referring to his loss, he did it so delicately that Mabel was touched, and liked him better for his indication of feeling than she had ever been able to do before. Her own sorrow was genuine enough, requiring no artificial stimulus and no outward tokens to keep it alive, and if Vincent could have been assured of this, it would have reconciled him to all else. No callousness nor forgetfulness on the part of others could have had power to wound him so long as he should live on in the memory of the girl he had loved. But it is better far for those who are gone that they should be impervious alike to our indifference and our grief, for the truest grief will be insensibly deadened by time, and could not long console the least exacting for the ever-widening oblivion. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The Giant's Robe by F. Anstey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. A turning point. Mark came down to the little back parlour at Malakoff Terrace one dull January morning to find the family already assembled there, with the exception of Mrs. Ashburn, who was breakfasting in bed, an unusual indulgence for her. "Mark," said Trixie, as she leaned back in her chair and put up her face for his morning greeting, "there's a letter for you on your plate." It was not difficult to observe a suppressed excitement amongst all the younger members of his family concerning this letter. They had finished their breakfast and fallen into some curious speculations as to Mark's correspondent before he came in. Now 3 pairs of eyes were watching him as he strolled up to his seat. Mr. Ashburn alone seemed unconscious or indifferent. Of late Mark had not had very many letters, and this particular one bore the name of Chilton and Fladgate on the flap of the envelope. The Ashburns were not a literary family, but they knew this as the name of a well-known firm of publishers, and it had roused their curiosity. Mark read the name too. For a moment it gave him a throb of excitement, the idea coming to him that, somehow, the letter concerned his own unfortunate manuscripts. It was true that he had never had any communication with this particular firm, but these wild, vague impressions are often independent of actual fact. He took it up and half began to open it. Then he remembered what it probably was, and, partly with the object of preserving Vincent's secret still as far as possible, but chiefly, it must be owned, from a malicious pleasure he took in disappointing the expectation he saw around him, put the letter still unopened in his pocket. "Why don't you open it?" asked Trixie impatiently, who was cherishing the hope that some magnificent literary success had come at last to her favourite brother. "Manners," explained Mark laconically. "Nonsense!" said Trixie. "You don't treat us with such ceremony as all that." "Not lately," said Mark. "That's how it is. It's bad for a family to get lax in these little matters of mutual courtesy. I'm going to see if I can't raise your tone. This is the beginning." "I'm sure we're very much obliged to you," from Martha. I'm quite satisfied with my own tone. It's quite high enough for me, thank you." "Yes, I forgot," said Mark. "I've heard it very high indeed sometimes. I wronged you, Martha. Still, you know, we might all except you, Martha be more polite to one another without causing ourselves any internal injury, mightn't we?" "Well, Mark," said Trixie, "all you have to do is to ask our leave to open the letter, if you're really so particular." "Is that in the etiquette book?" inquired Mark. "Don't be ridiculous. Why don't you ask our leave?" "I suppose because I want to eat my breakfast. Nothing is so prejudicial, my love, to the furtherance of the digestive process as the habit of reading at meals. Any medical man will tell you that." "Perhaps," suggested Martha, "Mark has excellent reasons for preferring to read his letter alone." "Do you know, Martha," said Mark, "I really think there's something in that." "So do I," said Martha, "more than you would care for us to know, evidently. But don't be afraid, Mark, whether it's a bill or a love letter, or another publisher's rejection, we don't want to know your secrets, do we, Cuthbert?" "Very amiable of you to say so," said Mark. "Then I shan't annoy you if I keep my letter to myself, shall I? Because I rather thought of doing it." "Eh? Doing what? What is Mark saying about a letter?" broke in Mr. Ashburn. He had a way of striking suddenly like this into conversations. "Somebody has written me a letter, father," said Mark. "I was telling Martha I thought I should read it presently." But even when he was alone he felt in no hurry to possess himself of the contents. "I expect it's the usual thing," he thought. "Poor Vincent is out of all that now. Let's see how they let him down," and he read: "Dear Sir, We have read the romance entitled Glamour, which you have done us the honour to forward some time since. It is a work which appears to us to possess decided originality and merit, and which may be received with marked favour by the public, while it can hardly fail in any case to obtain a reception which will probably encourage its author to further efforts. Of course, there is a certain risk attending its reception which renders it impossible for us to offer such terms for a first book as may be legitimately demanded hereafter for a second production by the same pen. We will give you," and here followed the terms, which struck Mark as fairly liberal for a first book by an unknown author. "Should you accept our offer, will you do us the favour to call upon us here at your earliest convenience, when all preliminary matters can be discussed. We are, etc., Chilton and Fladgate." Mark ran hurriedly through this letter with a feeling, first of incredulous wonder, then of angry protest against the bull–headed manner in which fortune had dealt out this favour. Vincent had been saved the dreary delays, the disappointments and discouragements which are the lot of most fine books. He had won a hearing at once, and where was the use of it? No praise or fame among men could reach him now. If he had been alive, Mark thought bitterly, if a letter like this would have rescued him from all he detested, and thrown open to him the one career for which he had any ambition, he might have waited for it long and vainly enough. But he began by being indifferent, and, if fortune had required any other inducement to shower her gifts on him, his death had supplied it. He chafed over this as he went up to the City, for there was another holiday class that day at St. Peter's. He thought of it at intervals during the morning, and always resentfully. What increased his irritation above everything was the fact that the publishers evidently regarded him as the author of the book, and he would have the distasteful task put upon him of enlightening them. When the day's duties were over, he found himself putting on his hat and coat in company with the Reverend Mr. Shelford, who was also in charge of one of the classes formed for the relief of parents and the performance of holiday work, and the two walked out together, Mark intending to call at once and explain his position to Messrs. Chilton and Fladgate. "What are you going to do with yourself, Ashburn, now?" said Mr. Shelford, in his abrupt way as they went along. "Going to be a schoolmaster and live on the crambe repetita all your life, eh?" "I don't know," said Mark sullenly. "Very likely. Take my advice. I'm old enough to offer it unasked. Give yourself a chance while you can, of a future which won't cramp and sour and wear you as this will. If you feel any interest in the boys—" "Which I don't," put in Mark. "Exactly, which you don't. But if you did, I remember I did once, in some of 'em, and helped 'em on, and spoke to the headmaster about 'em, and so on, well, they'll pass out of your class and look another way when they meet you afterwards. As for the dullards, they'll always be with you, like the poor, down at the bottom like a sediment, sir, and much too heavy to stir up. I can't imagine them now. My temper gets the better of me, God forgive me for it, and I say things I'm sorry for, and that don't do me or them any good, and they laugh at me. But I've got my parish to look after, and it's not a large one, but it acts as an antidote. You're not even in orders, so there's no help for you that way. And the day will come when the strain gets too much for you, and you'll throw the whole thing up in disgust, and find yourself forced to go through the same thing somewhere else, or begin the world in some other capacity. Choose some line in which hard work and endurance for years will bring you in a more substantial reward than that." "Well," said Mark, for whom this gloomy view of his prospects reflected his own forebodings, "I am reading for the Bar. I went up for my call examination the other day." "Ah, is that so? I'm glad to hear of it. A fine profession, sir. Constant variety and excitement. For the pleader, that is to say?" Mr. Shelford shared the lay impression that pleading was a form of passionate appeal to judge and jurymen. "And of course you would plead in court. The law has some handsome prizes at its disposal too, but you should have an attorney or two to push you on, they say. Perhaps you can count on that." "I wish I could," said Mark, "but the fact is my ambition doesn't lie in a legal direction at all. I don't care very much about the Bar." "Do you care very much about anything? Does your ambition lie anywhere?" "Not now. It did once. Literature, you know. But that's all over." "I remember, to be sure. They rejected that Christmas piece of yours, didn't they? Well, if you've no genuine talent for it, the sooner you find it out the better for you. If you feel you've something inside of you that you must out in chapters and volumes, it generally comes, and all the discouragement in the world won't keep it down. It's like those stories of demoniacal possession in the Anatomy. You know your Burton, I dare say. Some of the possessed brought globes of hair, and such like baggage, out of themselves, but others stones with inscriptions. If the demon gets too strong for you, try and produce a stone with a good readable inscription on it, not 3 globes of hair for the circulating libraries." "We shall see," said Mark, laughing. "I must leave you here. I have an appointment with Chilton and Fladgate just by." "Aye, aye," said the old gentleman, wagging his head. "Publishers, aren't they? Don't tell me your ambition's dead if it's taken you as far as that. But I won't ask any more questions. I shall hope to be able to congratulate you shortly. I won't keep you away from your publishers any longer." "They're not my publishers yet," said Mark. "They have made me some proposals, but I have not accepted them at present." He knew what a false impression this would leave with his companion, bare statement of fact as it was, but he made it deliberately, feeling almost as much flattered by the unconscious increase of consideration in the other's voice and manner as if there had been the slightest foundation for it. They said good bye, and the old clergyman went on and was swallowed up in the crowd, thinking as he went, "Publishing, eh? A good firm too. I don't think he could afford to do it at his own expense. Perhaps there's more ballast in him after all than I gave him credit for. I can't help liking the young fellow somehow, too. I should like to see him make a good start." Mark, having sent up his name by one of the clerks behind the imposing mahogany counters, was shown through various swinging doors into a waiting room, where the magazines and books symmetrically arranged on the table gave a certain flavour of dentistry to the place. Mark turned them over with a quite unreasonable nervousness, but the fact was he shrank from what he considered the humiliation of explaining that he was a mere agent. It occurred to him for the first time, too, that Holroyd's death might possibly complicate matters, and he felt a vague anger against his dead friend for leaving him in such a position. The clerk returned with a message that Mr. Fladgate would be happy to see Mark at once, and so he followed upstairs and along passages with glimpses through open doors of rooms full of clerks and desks, until they came to a certain room into which Mark was shown, a small room with a considerable litter of large wicker trays filled with proofs, packets and rolls of manuscripts of all sizes, and piles of books and periodicals, in the midst of which Mr. Fladgate was sitting with his back to the light, which was admitted through windows of ground glass. He rose and came forward to meet Mark, and Mark saw a little reddish-haired and whiskered man, with quick eyes, and a curious perpendicular fold in the forehead above a short blunt nose, a mobile mouth, and a pleasantly impulsive manner. "How do you do, Mr. Beauchamp?" he said heartily, using the nom de plume with an air of implied compliment. "And so you've made up your mind to entrust yourself to us, have you? That's right. I don't think you'll find any reason to regret it. I don't indeed." Mark said he was sure of that. "Well, now, as to the book," continued Mr. Fladgate, "I've had the pleasure of looking through it myself, as well as Mr. Blackshaw, our reader, and I must tell you that I agree with him in considering that you have written a very remarkable book. As we have told you, you know, it may or may not prove a pecuniary success, but however that may be, my opinion of it will remain the same. It ought, in my judgment, to ensure you a certain standing at once. At once!" Mark heard this with a pang of jealousy. Long before, he had dreamed of just such an interview, in which he should be addressed in some such manner. His dream was being fulfilled now with relentless mockery. "But there is a risk," said Mr. Fladgate, "a decided risk, which brings me to the subject of terms. Are you satisfied with the offer we made to you? You see that a first book——" "Excuse me for one moment," said Mark desperately. "I'm afraid you imagine that I wrote the book." "That certainly was my impression," said Mr. Fladgate, with a humorous light in his eye. "The only address on the manuscript was yours, and I came to the not unnatural conclusion that Mr. Ashburn and Mr. Beauchamp were one and the same. Am I to understand that is not the case?" "The book," said Mark. What it cost him to say this! "The book was written by a friend of mine, who went abroad some time ago." "Indeed? Well, we should prefer to treat with him in person, of course, if possible." "It isn't possible," said Mark. "My friend was lost at sea, but he asked me to represent him in this matter, and I believe I know his wishes." "I've no doubt of it. But you see, Mr. Ashburn, this must be considered a little. I suppose you have some authority from him in writing, to satisfy us, merely as a matter of business, that we are dealing with the right person." "I have not, indeed," said Mark. "My friend was very anxious to retain his incognito." "He must have been, very much so," said Mr. Fladgate, coughing. "Well, perhaps you can bring me some writing of his to that effect. You may have it among your papers, eh?" "No," said Mark. "My friend did not think it necessary to give me one. He was anxious to—" "Quite so. Then you can procure me a line or two, perhaps?" "I told you that my friend was dead," said Mark, a little impatiently. So you did, to be sure. I forgot. I thought—but no matter. Well, Mr. Ashburn, if you can't say anything more than this—anything, you understand, which puts you in a position to treat with us, I'm afraid I must ask time to think over this. If your friend is really dead, I suppose your authority is determined. Perhaps, however, his anxiety to preserve his incognito has led him to allow this rumour of his death to be circulated." "I don't think that is likely," said Mark, wondering at an undercurrent of meaning in the publisher's tone, a meaning which had nothing sinister in it, and yet seemed urging him to contradict himself for some reason. "That is your last word, then?" said Mr. Fladgate, and there was a sharp inflection as of disappointment and irritation in his voice, and the fold in his forehead deepened. "It must be," said Mark, rising. "I have kept you too long already." "If you really must go," said Mr. Fladgate, not using the words in their conventional sense of polite dismissal. "But, Mr. Ashburn, are you quite sure that this interview might not be saved from coming to nothing, as it seems about to do? Might not a word or two from you set things right again? I don't wish you to tell me anything you would rather keep concealed, But really, this story you tell me about a Mr. Vincent Beauchamp who is dead only ties our hands, you understand, ties our hands." "If so," said Mark uncomfortably, "I can only say I am very sorry for it. I don't see how I can help it." He was beginning to feel that this business of Holroyd's had given him quite enough trouble. "Now, Mr. Ashburn, as I said before, I should be the last man to press you, but really, you know, really, this is a trifle absurd. I think you might be a little more frank with me, I do indeed. There is no reason why you should not trust me." Was this man tempting him, thought Mark? Could he be so anxious to bring out this book that he was actually trying to induce him to fabricate some story which would get over the difficulties that had arisen? As a mere matter of fact, it may be almost unnecessary to mention that no such idea had occurred to worthy Mr. Fladgate, who, though he certainly was anxious to secure the book if he could, by any legitimate means, was anything but a publishing Mephistopheles. He had an object, however, in making this last appeal for confidence, as will appear immediately. But, innocent as he was, Mark's imagination conjured up a bland demon tempting him to some act of unspeakable perfidy. He trembled, but not with horror. "What do you mean?" he stammered. Mr. Fladgate gave a glance of keen amusement at the pale, troubled face of the young man before him. "What do I mean?" he repeated. "Come, I've known sensitive women try to conceal their identity, and even their sex, from their own publishers. I've known men even persuade themselves they didn't care for notoriety. But such a determined instance of what I must take leave to call the literary ostrich I don't think I ever did meet before. I never met a writer so desperately anxious to remain unknown that he would rather take his manuscript back than risk his secret with his own publisher. But don't you see that you have raised, I don't use the term in the least offensively, the mask, so to speak? You should have sent somebody else here to-day if you wished to keep me in the dark. I've not been in business all these years, Mr. Ashburn, without gaining a little experience. I do think, I'm able to know an author when I see him. We are all liable to error, but I am very much mistaken if this Mr. Vincent Beauchamp, who was so unfortunately lost at sea, is not to be recovered alive by a little judicious dredging. Do think if you can't produce him. Come, he's not in very deep water. Bring him up, Mr. Ashburn, bring him up." "You make this very difficult for me," said Mark in a low voice. He knew now how greatly he had misjudged the man who had spoken with such an innocent, amiable pride in his own surprising discernment. He also felt how easy and how safe it would be to take advantage of this misunderstanding, and what a new future it might open to him. But he was struggling still against the temptation so unconsciously held out to him. "I might retort that, I think. Now, be reasonable, Mr. Ashburn. I assure you the writer, whoever he may be, has no cause to be ashamed of the book. The time will come when he will probably be willing enough to own it. Still, if he wishes to keep his real name secret, I tell him, through you, that he may surely be content to trust that to us. We have kept such secrets before. Not very long, to be sure, as a general rule, but then that was because the authors usually relieved us from the trouble. The veil was never lifted by us." "I think you said," began Mark, as if thinking aloud, "that other works by the same author would be sure of acceptance." "I should be very glad to have an opportunity, in time, of producing another book by Mr. Vincent Beauchamp. But Mr. Beauchamp, as you explained, is unhappily no more. Perhaps these are earlier manuscripts of his?" Mark had been seized with the desire of making one more attempt, in spite of his promise to his uncle, to launch those unhappy paper ships of his, Sweet Bells Jangled and One Fair Daughter. For an instant it occurred to him that he might answer this last question in the affirmative. He had little doubt that if he did, his books would meet with a very different reception from that of Messrs. Leadbitter and Gandy. Still, that would only benefit Holroyd, not himself. And then he recollected, only just in time, that the difference in handwriting, which was very considerable, would betray him. He looked confused and said nothing. Mr. Fladgate's patience began to tire. "We don't seem to be making any way, do we?" he said, with rather affected pleasantry. "I'm afraid I must ask you to come to a decision on this without any more delay. Here is the manuscript you sent us. If the real author is dead, we are compelled to return it with much regret. If you can tell me anything which does away with the difficulty, this is the time to tell it. Of course you will do exactly as you please, but after what you have chosen to tell us we can hardly see our way, as I said, to treat you without some further explanation. Come, Mr. Ashburn, am I to have it or not?" "Give me a little time," said Mark faintly, and the publisher, as he had expected, read the signs of wavering in his face, though it was not of the nature he believed it to be. Mark sat down again and rested his chin on his hand, with his face turned away from the other's eyes. A conflict was going on within him such as he had never been called upon to fight before, and he had only a very few minutes allowed him to fight it. Perhaps in these crises a man does not always arrange pros and cons to contend for him in the severely logical manner with which we find him doing it in print. The forces on the enemy's side can generally be induced to desert. All the advantages which would follow if he once allowed himself to humour the publisher's mistake were very prominently before Mark's mind. The dangers and difficulties kept in the background. He was incapable of considering the matter coolly. He felt an overmastering impulse upon him, and he had never trained himself to resist his impulses for very long. There was very little of logical balancing going on in his brain. It began to seem terribly, fatally easy to carry out this imposition. The fraud itself grew less ugly and more harmless every instant. He saw his own books, so long kept out in the cold by ignorant prejudice, accepted on the strength of Holroyd's glamour, and once fairly before the public, taking the foremost rank in triumph and rapidly eclipsing their forerunner. He would be appreciated at last, delivered from the life he hated, able to lead the existence he longed for. All he wanted was a hearing. There seemed no other way to obtain it. He had no time to lose. How could it injure Holroyd? He had not cared for fame in life. Would he miss it after his death? The publishers might be mistaken. The book might be unnoticed altogether. He might prove to be the injured person. But as Mr. Fladgate seemed convinced of its merit, as he would evidently take anything alleged to come from the same source without a very severe scrutiny, there was nothing for it but to risk this contingency. Mark was convinced that publishers were influenced entirely by unreasoning prejudices. He thoroughly believed that his works would carry all before them if any firm could once overcome their repugnance to his powerful originality, and here was one firm at least prepared to lay that aside at a word from him. Why should he let it go unsaid? The money transactions caused him the most hesitation. If he took money for another man's work, there was a name, and a very ugly name for that, but he would not keep it. As soon as he learnt the names of Holroyd's legal representatives, whoever they might be, he would pay the money over to them, without mentioning the exact manner in which it had become due. In time, when he had achieved a reputation for himself, he could give back the name he had borrowed for a time. At least, he told himself he could do so. He stood in no danger of detection, or if he did, it was very slight. Vincent was not the man to confide in more than one person. He had owned as much. He had been reticent enough to conceal his real surname from his publishers, and now he could never reveal the truth. All this rushed through his mind in a hurried, confused form. All his little vanities and harmless affectations and encouragements of false impressions had made him the less capable of resisting now. "Well?" said Mr. Fladgate at last. Mark's heart beat fast. He turned round and faced the publisher. "I suppose I had better trust you," he said awkwardly, and with a sort of shamefaced constraint that was admirably in keeping with his confession, though not artificial. "I think so. Then you are the man. This book glamours your own work. If you must have it, yes," said Mark desperately. The words were spoken now, and for good or ill He must abide by them henceforth to the end. End of chapter 9.